I am here and welcome back here at the Cape Town City Hall, where a lot of anticipation around the budget speech this afternoon. Of course, I want to bring into this conversation Mr. Godongwana from the UDM. Good morning to you, sir. As the UDM, what do you expect the Finance Minister to focus on in his budget speech?
Well, the Minister of Finance is going to obviously numberize the plan that the President outlined during the State of the Nation address. And chief among these issues would be to deal with the energy crisis and how they can support, in inverted commas, businesses. But we've seen during COVID-19 that most of the businesses that were supported by government were white businesses, businesses that have been formalized and well established. Most of our businesses could not qualify because they did meet their criteria, their stringent criteria. So whether you're looking at the loan guarantee scheme, our people did not benefit much. But even if now you're talking about solar panels, who's going to benefit from solar panels and inverters? It's white businesses, big businesses that are well established and not the spaza shops in the townships. And the problem with me is that while the government talks about trying to save jobs, they don't really save jobs with their initiatives, because then they bail out companies and the companies continue to retrench our people. That's one problem. But the other issue is, what message then are you sending to the Magogos in Kailicha, to the Magogos in Ngaba village, in Pirimishin and other villages, where they are not going to qualify for inverters, or they are not going to qualify for solar panels just because they are not business people, but their food continues to rot in the fridge. They have to spend twice the amount of money to be able to buy the same item because it rots many times. But the other issue is the South African Reserve Bank put the growth forecast at about 0.3%, which is just over 0.25%. Then the minister must tell us as to exactly how it intends to reignite growth, because that's the only way you can be able to create jobs and make sure that you fight unemployment in South Africa in general. But the other issue is we need to have rules for public debt. You can't have a government that says we expect the public debt to go to 70-80% without stringent rules and guidelines of what limits we should put in place for public debts. The situation will continue to get out of hand.
And in terms of dealing with the issue of the rising cost of living, any measures that you can recommend to him to introduce?
No, obviously. They can't. Firstly, for an example, there's no room for them to increase any taxes, because they'll be making matters worse, because the cost of living on average has increased by about 13.9% if you look at current statistics. And that means our people are struggling to survive. They're struggling to make ends meet. The first thing is that they must make sure that they don't increase taxes, but also they provide enough support, or the social safety net, where they provide more support to the poor, take funding from elsewhere and transfer it elsewhere. But also, now that we have windfalls from the commodity prices, is it not time for us to actually start considering bringing back VAT to 14% instead of the current 15%, because we know that it is regressive in nature?
Lastly, do you expect him to appropriate money for this state of national disaster to support it?
No, of course. That's what they wanted to do. The reason why they declared this national state of disaster is because they wanted to do exactly what they did during COVID-19, dole out monies without proper accountability, in the majority of instances even bypass parliament as they make those decisions. It's important for us because, remember, we're the vanguard as the opposition. We serve as the vanguard of the South African constitutional democracy. If we see that, we must not hesitate to take them to court, because I think we're caught napping during the first phase, during COVID-19, when they declared the national state of disaster. But now we need to make sure that we're vigilant.
All right, thank you so much, Mr. Godongwana from the UDM. For more political reaction, I'm going to bring into this conversation Mr. Mzwanele Nyonso, the president of the PAC. Good morning to you, sir. Firstly, the minister's budget speech this afternoon, your expectation as the PAC?
In a normal circumstances, I would expect the minister to prioritize jobs, to prioritize rural development. I mean, potholes, roads, infrastructure in a normal circumstances, because this is the ANC government. We expect him to prioritize borrowing monies from international finance markets, thus taking us to the debts, what they've been doing anyway all these years. And we also hope that they are not going to touch the PIC money, because the workers' money must not be touched. And we also hope that they are not going to, of course they will prioritize money for this so-called disaster that was declared by the president, when in fact it is going to be their opportunity to loot state funds as they've done with the COVID-19. So we really expect nothing from them. This is the ANC we're talking about.
And particularly to focus on cushioning the impact of this load shedding on the poor, what measures do you think the finance minister can introduce to actually ease the cost of living for the poor?
No, firstly, they must avail jobs. Remember, every problem in this land, in this country, it's about land. We have been saying this and people were thinking we're joking when we said we must prioritize land and land first and then all shall follow. But if the land was addressed, the land question in this country was addressed, we would not be talking about lack of jobs today. We would not be talking about poverty. We would not be talking about all these things that are happening today. But because the economy is still in the hands of the white people, that's the reason. So we really don't expect them to come up with measures to save African people.
All right, thank you so much, Mr. Mzwanele Nyonzo, the president of the PAC. I've got the red berets on my right, not to say you're on the right, but welcome as Sinawo Tambo, spokesperson of the EFF. As the EFF, are you going to firstly be attending this budget speech?
Yes, we're attending because we want to be present and witness the blatant criminality which is about to be announced here today. So the first thing that we expect Enoch Godongwana to announce is that they are going to take the debt of Eskom, which amounts to over 400 billion, onto the balance sheet of the state. Now, this is debt which was accumulated to build Sihle Mkhize and build the entity which is Eskom in itself. Now, one must ask, why are they doing this when they have a sole intention of privatizing Eskom and selling off its generation capacity? Because that means that we are going to take that debt, credit it to the taxpayer, which is me and you, and sell off Eskom as a purely profitable entity to the private sector to ensure that it accumulates profit with no debt obligation to the assets that were established with money that is now going to be paid by the taxpayer. That is pure criminality. If there's a true belief that the private sector can turn Eskom around, it must buy Eskom with its debt. We mustn't be given the debt of Eskom and then sell off a purely profitable entity to the private sector with Sihle, with Mudupi, with coal power stations, for them to then come and pretend that they've turned it around when they make profit. We're not interested in Eskom being a profit-making entity. We want it to provide electricity.
Do you suspect that it's going to be sold off, as you allege?
That has been the announcement each and every budget speech, and it's a mere matter of implementation. So the deliberate man-made crisis that we're in now, such as the stage 6 load shedding, is because of the intention to sell off Eskom. That is why we are in this situation, so that by the time Eskom is sold off, by the time the debt of Eskom, which has established its assets, is given to the taxpayer, we are going to celebrate because the private sector is going to pretend to have turned around an entity which they bought with ready-made assets and without any debt. So they are buying an entity with no debt obligation. So that is something that they're going to pretend as having saved Eskom once it finally gets sold off to them. And that is a nefarious criminal plot that is happening, that is going to be announced here today. But further to that, they're going to attempt to announce a so-called state bank today here without any definable developmental agenda. So we want to know what is going to differentiate the so-called state bank from commercial banks in this country. What is the mandate of this so-called state bank? Before we jump into an acceptance of it and celebration of it, what is the character going to be? How is it going to be different from FNB, ABSA, and the commercial banks that exist in this country? And I think another point that we need to make is that we are going to adopt an unconstitutional budget here today. Well, not all of us, those who are going to be in their majority voting.
How so? How is it going to be unconstitutional?
So in South Africa, there are 9 million indigent homes, meaning 9 million poor households that are constitutionally obliged to receive free water, free electricity. But it's only 2.4 million, around 2.4 million, which are registered and accounted for by municipalities, meaning almost 7 million of households which are poor do not receive free water or electricity. But those budgets get adopted based on false data and false statistics by municipalities, and it gets ratified by Treasury. So there's a toxic relationship of our Treasury with our municipalities that operate on false data and false statistics and do not provide free water and electricity to a majority of our people based on that. And that is something that must be highlighted, that it is unconstitutional. So there's a lot of criminality and a lot of unconstitutionality that constitutes the budget that will be adopted by the ANC-led state here today, presented here today. And that is something that the EFF wants to highlight. But of course, we'll sit and listen and make our observations and debate that budget in due course.
Lastly, the issue of the national state of disaster, it must be funded. Perhaps your views on that?
It's another act of criminality. In our understanding, the national state of disaster is yet another method for the ANC to subvert procurement processes which have vetting processes as well. It's a manner for them to be able to do emergency procurement. They did it with the PPEs. They want to do it now in the sector of electricity. And what they're going to do in the energy sector in particular is use emergency procurement measures to ensure that they plug in independent power producers which are parasitic to the state. So they're going to use that to approve private sector independent power producers plugging into the grid and paying them exorbitant amounts in order to do that. They are going to do that with the state of floods that are happening all across the country. So they utilize emergency to loot, and that is the character of the ANC. And any budgets that are allocated to that must be watched closely. And something else that we must be able to note is that Cyril Ramaphosa has established a network of his friends, leading envoys and presidential advisory boards in order to advise him on things that is not resolving over the past 8 years. How much are being paid to the people who are sitting at the head of these advisory boards, these panels, these networks, and all of these sorts of things that are so-called supposed to resolve the job and unemployment crisis, the electricity crisis, the violent crime crisis? There's all sorts of boards and advisory panels that have to be remunerated in order for them to provide non-existent advice to Cyril Ramaphosa. So we want to know how much are those people being paid, because we think those are kickbacks to his criminal network.
All right, thank you so much. Sinawo Tambo is spokesperson of the Economic Freedom Fighters. They're not quite sure in terms of how the government is going to fund this national state of disaster. Of course, the opposition parties seem to be having a consensus that they see this as a feeding frenzy of corruption. On that note, Naledi, we're going to cross back to you in Johannesburg.